Hello, I'm John Wilson. Welcome to This Cultural Life, the Radio 4 podcast in which I talk to leading creative figures about the key moments in their life and the most important cultural works that have helped fire their creative imagination. My guest is Bernardine Evaristo, a playwright, academic and novelist. She's been writing poetic and experimental works for more than 4 decades now. And in 2019, she became the first black woman to win the Booker Prize for her novel, Girl, Woman, Other. We met in a radio studio in Broadcasting House. Bernadine, welcome to This Cultural Life.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to it.
Good. Let's go back to the beginning, set the scene. You grew up in Woolwich in South London. Tell me about family life, first of all.
Well, I come from a very large family of 8 children. My parents had 8 children in 10 years. My father was Nigerian. He came over in 1949. And my mother was a white English woman who grew up not far from Woolwich, where I grew up. So there were 8 of us. So there were 7. 7 plus me. Yeah.
Fights over what was on the television every night?
I think when we were younger, I don't remember that. But I do remember my brothers wanting to watch Match of the Day on a Saturday afternoon. And I wanted to watch film. And they kind of, they overrode my wishes.
And growing up in London, South London in the 60s and 70s, how aware of racism were you? We
were a sort of mixed interracial, biracial family in a white area. So it existed. For sure. And, you know, they used to smash our windows in on a regular basis. And we knew that was because we were brown people. But it was only when I was a teenager that I started to engage with the idea of racism. But at what point I became conscious, to be honest, of this thing called racism that existed in the world, I don't really remember.
But you say about smashing windows, your windows.
Yes, but I don't know if we'd have said, oh, they're racist. Actually, I think the term was prejudiced. That was the term that was bandied around in the 60s when I was very young.
Were you a big reader?
Yeah, from the age of 5. Certainly, I was always going to the library and reading books, and every week, you know, getting out as many as I could and then returning to the library. There wasn't a lot to do, even though we were a large family. We weren't really allowed out to play because my dad was incredibly strict. And also I think he was scared for us. He didn't want us out there on the streets as a black family in a white area. So my entertainment was reading.
Were there any books that you read at the time that, looking back, that you recognise as having fired your imagination in some way that made you think, I could do that, I could tell stories? Not
really, no. No, not particular books. Because the books were borrowed from the library, we didn't have them in the house. And I sometimes need the visual evidence of things around me. But because the books weren't part of my childhood, you know, in a permanent way, they came and went, you know, within a week. I don't really remember a lot of my early reading material. The book I do remember is, I think it's called The Ballet Shoes by Noel Streatfeild, which was about an eccentric family, which of course my family was quite eccentric. And that's because I had a copy. It was given to me for Christmas.
So it was about ownership. It was about that being your book rather than
yes,
one that you had to borrow.
It was there. It would have been, you know, I probably kept it into my 20s, I think.
We've asked you to come up with some key moments from your life, events and culture that had a profound effect on your own creative imagination. Tell me about your first choice.
So the Catholic Church. So my mother was a Catholic. My father wasn't religious at all. And so she was very deeply religious. And so my first school was a convent school. It was literally the school that was next door to where I grew up. And the house I grew up in had once been part of the school. And I went there from the age of 5 to 9. And so we had mass every morning. And then from the age of 5, I went to church. And from the age of 5 to 15, I went to church every Sunday. And then to confession, I think it was either every Saturday or every other Saturday, from about the age of 7 or 8, where, you know, you would go to church and go into the booth, I can't remember what it was called, and confess your sins.
And were you there willingly? Was it something you looked forward to, or was there a sense of obligation?
Not at all. Not at all. It was ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. At the age of 7, to be made to feel bad about your life, you know, and you would make up a sin. right? Because there were no sins. I wasn't, at the age of 7, 8, 9, 10, what sins was I committing? So you'd sit there and you think, okay, what am I going to say this week? And you say, I didn't pray. I didn't pray every night before I went to bed. And that would be it, Or maybe if you stole something, I don't know, stole some money from my mum's purse or something, which I think I did do. You might say something like that. But essentially, you'd have to make stuff up.
What about the performative aspect? What are the rituals of Mass?
Yeah.
Did that have an impact?
So the church was incredibly boring for the most part. And in the 60s, the Mass was said in Latin. And of course, the Catholic Mass is very ritualistic and the language is very rich. And it was much, much later, actually not so long ago, that I realised that I think that shaped my writing. I had spent, 10 years being absolutely steeped in the language of the church, singing the hymns, hearing the sermons, the Bible, the language of the Bible was all very poetic and very heightened.
And the Latin as well. I mean, there was a sort of mystery to that and a poetry.
Yes, and I did do Latin at school for 5 years. I took a Latin O-level, and I use a lot of languages in my books. And I think my sort of natural propensity to do that probably partly came from the fact that I studied Latin, I studied French for 5 years, Spanish for 2, and that Latin, which was so familiar to me as a child. And so looking at the church, yes, could not wait to leave, hated going every Sunday. But actually, I'm the writer I am partly because of the influence of my relationship to the church from a very young age.
You won the Booker Prize in 2019. For many readers, Girl, Woman, Other was a kind of introduction to Bernardine Evaristo, and yet you've been writing for, 30, 40 years up to that point. And the early books were often poetic, weren't they? Sort of verse novels, prose poems. What was the inspiration for that form?
Well, I think there was the church influence, and then there was the theatre that I was involved in at a young age, also, performing in Shakespeare at school, and also Under Milkwood by Dylan Thomas, which I love so much. And so I was influenced by the early, by that sort of early experience of those two areas of my life. And then I saw a play called For Colour Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough in 1979 by an African-American writer called Ntozake Shange. And she had produced what she called a choreo poem. So it was the story of 7 black African-American women on stage telling their stories through poetry and sort of dancing and moving to it. And I saw that when I was at drama school and loved it. And I kind of realised that spoke to me, the stories spoke to me as a young black woman growing up in this very white society. But also I loved the fact that she was experimenting with form, because I didn't feel that I was part of the British tradition. I wasn't accepted as British. I kind of rejected any kind of British notions of culture in a way. And so this drama was, it kind of struck a chord with me.
Just getting back to Under Milk Wood, in terms of, the multiplicity of voices of characterisation there, there's a link, isn't there, between that and Girl, Woman, Other, in which you have 12 characters, 12 scenes.
Mrs. Ogmore Pritchard.
La-di-da.
Got a man in Billswell. And he got a little telescope to look at birds.
Willy-nilly said.
Remember her first husband? He didn't need a telescope.
Used to look at them undressing through the keyhole.
And he used to shout, tally-ho!
Was that a school book, or was that something that you were taught that was on the syllabus?
I played Captain Cat, so it was introduced to us in the drama group. It wasn't on the school syllabus, and I performed it. So the other thing that I've realised is that my early career as an actor gave me a very particular relationship with character and the text. And later, when I left drama school and I started to perform my own work professionally, that intensified my relationship with the text. And so as an actor, I was inhabiting my own writing and then communicating it, performing it to audiences. And I think if you look at my books and the way I've created characters, they often come across as their kind of characters often jump off the page slightly larger than life, and hopefully, and I'm told they are very realistic. It's almost as if these characters really exist in the world. And I think that can be tracked back to my early experience of writing through performance.
And there is, I think, a real acute sense of dialogue in your books and individual and very distinct voices. What about your own accent?
My mother transferred onto us a certain way of speaking, which wasn't South London, you know what I mean? We weren't talking like that at all. But at the age of 14, I made the conscious effort to develop more of a RP accent through an experience. I was ushering at the Tram Shed in Woolwich, which was a venue, it still is. And the person next to me, one of my peers from the youth theatre, was asking people if they'd like a programme. She was saying, would you like a programme? And I was saying, do you want a programme? And it was a light bulb moment.
Subtle difference.
Subtle difference, but I heard it and then I changed how I spoke.
And your next big creative spark predates drama school. It's youth theatre. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so from the age of 12, I went to the local youth theatre. I rocked up one Friday evening with one of my sisters who was very embarrassed and shy and went and hid in the toilet for the whole of the evening. And I just got stuck in and absolutely loved it and felt very welcome there. And it was so engaging. Youth theatre is so engaging for children, you know, because you're there, you're working as part of a little community. Certainly the one I went to, everybody was welcome. And for most of my time there, I was the only black child. And I didn't feel it. I was accepted. It was a very nurturing, safe space. It was my introduction to the arts, to creativity. I started going to theatre. That was 1972. I started going to theatre. I haven't stopped. And then eventually went to drama school and became a performer myself.
But joining that youth theatre, when you walked in, I presume there was a sort of an initial get-together, a moment when you had to kind of set out who you were. Did it feel natural? Were you a natural performer in the spotlight?
I don't think I was particularly extrovert or anything. You know, I felt quite shy, but then people tell me things that contradicts that. You know, memory is very fickle, isn't it? So somebody from my secondary school, you know, we had a chat recently and she was going on about how extrovert I was and larger than life personality. And I was like, oh, yeah, I think I might have been. But that's not how I saw myself. That's not how I felt inside.
Do you remember the first time you saw a performance on stage? I mean, what was the first play that you saw?
Yes, it was a Bubble Theatre production. And the Bubble Theatre, I don't know if they're still going, but they basically performed in a bubble, which was a tent. And then they would tour to parks, basically, and set up in a park and give performances. And there was a mixed-race actress who's still going called Cleo Sylvester. And I remember seeing this mixed-race actress in this play and just being like stunned by it, you know. And perhaps that was the first time I thought maybe I could be an actor, because here is somebody who looked a little bit like me.
So that was your introduction to theatre. You went from youth theatre to drama school. And then in the early 80s, you set up your own theatre company, Theatre of Black Women. What was the mission?
The mission was to create our own theatre. By and about our lives, because nobody else was doing that. And in 1982, when we graduated, myself, Patricia St. Hilaire and Paulette Randall from Rose Bruford College, there was very little work for us. I mean, so we had two choices, either to try and find work, which is notoriously difficult for any actors anyway, let alone black women at that time, or to set up our own theatre company. And it made sense to set up our own theatre company. That's what we did. We raised funds and the company lasted for 6 years. We put on plays and eventually expanded, brought in other writers, directors, actors and so on. It did what it was meant to do for the time, which was to create a platform for black women's theatre in this country. It was the first of its kind.
Did you feel like you were breaking new ground in that way then?
Yes, we knew we were. And we were finding our way as well as theatre producers, as writers, even as young actors. We were new and we were working mainly with people who were also new to the profession. So kind of babies trying to create theatre, but not really having a strong support network around us. So the main thing I learned was the value of doing it for yourself, that it was possible to make a difference by getting off your arse and creating the theatre or the artistic projects that are not there for you.
The next big influence on your life and work that you've chosen is a personal relationship. With whom?
Yes. So I had relationships with men as up to the age of about 20. And then I spent a period of 10 years where I had relationships with women. And then I went back to being heterosexual again. And I had a relationship with a woman. They were the dominant person in the relationship. And I was slowly crushed. I mean, that's how I see it. I was slowly crushed by this person to the extent that I think I lost the capacity to be independent and to think for myself. Not completely, but they were always doing the thinking for me. And that was established very early on in the relationship when I felt that I was in love. And this person was very charismatic, and as is often the case, and I was completely overwhelmed by the wondrousness of their personality. But before I knew it, I had lost myself in that relationship. And I was being controlled by somebody. I changed the way I dress. We wore matching tracksuits and trainers. I was a very stylish dresser before then, quite flamboyant, very individualistic, very alternative. And
so
then
suddenly you had to conform.
Suddenly I was wearing sort of matching tracksuits from Olympus on Oxford Street, and trainers matching the tracksuits. And I think that shows how far gone I was in that relationship. And I was very strong before the relationship. Clearly you've heard about my life. I was running a theatre company. I was out there doing my thing. But I must have had a vulnerability and a chink in my armour, whereby this person moved in and took control of my life. But I don't think it was malicious on their part. I say that I was crushed, but I wasn't really crushed, because I don't think I'm crushable. I would not have recovered if I had been crushed. But I was definitely diminished, and also kind of full of self-doubt. I kind of doubted my own thoughts, doubted my opinions.
Did it feel like abuse?
It didn't. No, not at all. No. What I thought was I was in this relationship, and for some of that time, I didn't feel the effect of what was happening. It was only when the relationship became difficult and I started to fight back that I realised I was kind of trapped. And I thought I would be trapped for the rest of my life. I just didn't think I was going to be able to escape this person.
But while you were in that relationship, did it actually have a direct effect on the work that you were producing?
Yes, because this person was very encouraging of my writing to begin with. And I was completely seduced by that, by the praise. But of course, by the time the relationship started to become more problematic, then that was withdrawn. The praise was withdrawn, and actually history was rewritten, and she was then saying, oh yes, well, your work wasn't that great anyway. I was just saying it to encourage you.
And how long was it after the relationship ended that you felt like you could talk about this relationship?
I didn't talk about the relationship until I won the Booker, I think. I mean, obviously to people I did, people I know, but in terms of talking publicly about this relationship, it's only very recently.
And yet there's a relationship in Girl, Woman, Other, isn't there?
Yeah.
Which is a very similar dynamic.
Clearly, there are parallels between the relationship in Girl, Woman, Other and the relationship I had with this person. But I was very interested in exploring that power dynamic. And actually, I did it in another novel, Soul Taurus, in a very different way. The power dynamic between two people in a relationship where one of them is almost like a vampire, sucking on the energy of the person they are controlling. And when that person leaves that relationship, they flourish, but the vampire doesn't. The vampire just withers away. And I think that's interesting. And also, it is a way for me to process what happened. Because even today, I find it very interesting to talk about me, Bernardine Evaristo, being in that kind of relationship. And people are very surprised by it because they just can't equate the person before them, as you said, with the person I'm describing.
What about the relationships with your own family? Because there seems to be in your work a recurring fascination with roots, with ancestry.
I think family is a thread that runs throughout all of my books. My heritage is really interesting. I find it really interesting. And I found out just a few months ago that I can't trace, somebody has traced on my mother's English side over 320 years in this country. So it's 320 years of my family history in this country. I didn't know that when I was growing up. I kind of knew about my mother, obviously. I knew about my grandmother, who grew up in Islington, turn of the century. I knew that her mother was Irish. I knew about my grandfather, who I didn't know. That was it. I didn't know that my grandfather's grandfather was German, that he'd come over from Germany in the 1860s. I didn't know that the place I grew up in, Woolwich, had been the site for generations of my family, going back probably about 170 years.
Wow. Given what you were saying earlier about the racism in the childhood, bricks through the window, all that sort of thing, what difference do you think would that information have made to your sense of identity, self-worth?
Well, it would have been a great way to retaliate, right? When people said, go back to where you came from, which, it's the kind of thing that was said at that time. I think I would have it would have shaped my sense of my identity in this country, because it's inescapable. Over 320 years of a direct bloodline in this country. And I surely would have felt either more of a sense of belonging or even more of a sense of injustice at people who said I didn't belong because of the colour of my skin. And of course, there are people who will argue that you're only British or English if your roots can be traced back hundreds of years, which is nonsense, of course. But actually, my roots can be traced back hundreds of years.
But you've only just found that out, or relatively recently.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, isn't it? You think of second novel, Lara. That is a book in which you do, again, you're sort of tracing lineage and roots. So there's always been a fascination, because that book's 25 years ago?
That's 1997 that was published. And there are two versions of it. In the first version, I went back I explored my father's Brazilian ancestry, slavery in Brazil, travelling to West Africa, which is part of that history of that part of the world, which is why I have a Portuguese surname. And I also explored my mother's childhood and my father's childhood and so on. The second iteration of the book, I actually went back because I discovered the German ancestry and the Irish ancestry. So I added to it. So growing up, actually, feeling that I didn't belong, kind of feeling sort of unmoored, really, in a country where I should have belonged. And then with a father who didn't pass on his heritage, who didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to talk about Nigeria, didn't want to talk about his parents or anything. And then coming into my sense of Black identity as a young woman, and then being so curious about my own heritage, but also about Black heritage, Black history, the African diaspora, which of course has shaped my work ever since. And so Lara was where I kind of brought it together, where I fictionalised my family history in order to explore all the different aspects and to integrate it into who I was. By the end of the book, the character based on me takes a trip down the Amazon, as I did, and just feels that they've integrated everything into themselves. That they are who they are, and that they have this heritage that spans all these different cultures and communities, and that they are whole just as they are.
I've asked you to bring in some of your big formative moments, your influences, your inspirations on your creativity. The last one is possibly a bit surprising. It's about getting a job.
Yeah. Yeah, so I had a job actually at the BBC when I was 18, 19 in the distribution unit. And that actually was a full-time salary job, which was lots of fun. And I didn't actually get another full-time salary job until I joined Brunel University London in 2011. So I was freelance up to that point. So I had spent 30 years as a freelancer. And so getting a job meant that I had regular income. Universities operate in such a way that they give you enough time to get on with your research, which in my case are my books and various other things. And I had economic stability, which I'd never had before.
Your mum was a teacher, of course, wasn't she?
Yes, she was.
So you're kind of following in her footsteps?
No, not really. She was a school teacher.
Yeah, but don't you think there's possibly a sense of, like she was doing, of giving something back?
Oh, yes.
Of passing
yes,
something
definitely.
on?
Definitely. I like to think I do my own thing. And so I never wanted to be a teacher. And although I teach at the university, I'm a writer and I'm in the arts. It's not like I'm one of the kind of regular academics where actually teaching is their main focus. Teaching is part of what I do.
But I mean, is there a sense of, I don't know, I mean, maybe it's too tempting to read in about your father's activism, his political commitment. I think he served as a local councillor. Is there a sense, again, here of civic duty to an extent?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I wouldn't call it civic duty. I've been an activist, in the arts for a very long time. You can even track it back to Theatre Black Women as an activist theatre company, if you want to frame it like that. But at the same time, we were giving ourselves employment. But for the last 20 odd years or so, I've set up arts initiatives off my own back just to increase inclusivity in the arts. That's something that I do in tandem with my career as a writer, which is always my priority.
In the book Manifesto, you tell a story, you say, about how when you published Lara, you wrote a note to yourself, an affirmation, and you said the aim was to win the Booker Prize one day.
Yes.
You achieved that in 2019, of course. What's the next big target?
I'm not telling you. When I wrote, I've been writing affirmations for a very long time, about 25 years, and I have never shared them. I have a trunk load. I have never shared them with anybody. I keep them to myself. Because if I'd have told people all those years ago that not that I wanted to win the Booker Prize, but that I was going to, or that even that in my mind I had, which is actually how you do affirmations in the present tense, of course, they would have had me carted away, right? Because it would seemingly be such a ridiculous thing.
So it wasn't a hope when you wrote that note?
It was a visualization that I
to
had won
yourself.
it. Yeah.
What drives you on now?
Continuing to write the books, as always. There are so many stories. There's so many areas of our existence and imagined areas of our existence that I can write about. So many. And that's what I will continue to do. And also improve my skills. Because I do say in the book, there isn't a point of arrival.
Bernardine Evaristo, thank you very much for sharing your cultural life.
Thank you.